So I'm a San Diegan born and raised. I was literally born there, lived my whole life there, and the news of the shooting that occurred at the mosque today broke my heart, obviously for a ton of reasons. But you non-San Diegans, I wanted to provide you guys with a little bit of context into what a snapshot of San Diego culture looks like right now and the different influences that are impacting it, so that maybe you guys can look a little deeper into the awful tragedy that occurred today. So the first part that I wanted to tell you guys about is the breakup of towns. I know that a lot of people have this image of San Diego in their head as kind of like a vacation paradise, right? Beachy, sunny, it's always 75 degrees. But San Diego itself is not completely run by, like the 10 or 20 blocks of skyscrapers. In fact, some of the strongest influences on culture in San Diego happen outside of San Diego proper and actually occur in the towns that surround it. And each town kind of has its own influence of immigrants. Each town has its own influence of wealth. Each town has its own political influence. The town that I'm specifically from, if you're San Diegan, then you'll already have an image in your head as soon as I say it. I'm from El Cajon. And so El Cajon has the highest population of Middle Eastern people, not only within the county or even the state, but honestly in the nation. Like when you look at the numbers, there's only a couple cities that beat El Cajon in population of Middle Eastern people. And so by nature, that means that I grew up surrounded by people who practice Islam. There were also different subsets of Middle Eastern people who practice Christianity or who practiced other faiths. So there's actually a very large population of people who practice Islam in San Diego. And outside of just the Middle Eastern community, recently there has been a larger influx of North African people who also practice Islam. So the community is not only large, but it is also growing. Obviously, there are also a ton of Hispanic people, Mexican people specifically, and there's a good population of Asian people. And there's also obviously white folk. And San Diego is no different from any other state or any other county in the country where once there seems to be larger populations of people of color, the white folks start to move inland, kind of creating a bit of a segregation. And I'm not saying that San Diego is legally segregated, so please do not hop in my comments saying that I'm claiming that. But what I am saying is there are pockets of people who seem to want to get away from this cultural expansion, which I will say is ridiculous because it's San Diego, it's Hispanic by nature, but there are pockets of people who are moving further and further inland in an attempt to kind of create their own bubbles untouched by minority culture. And my city specifically seemed to be divided by that. So in my middle school, I would say about a quarter of the girls I went to school with wore hijab. When I attended a high school outside of my city, that was not the case. But there was a very large group of people who practice Islam or were Middle Eastern. The rest of them were Mexican, probably a few Filipinos, and a few white people. And the reason that all this matters is because you and I are likely both aware of the fact that there has been an increase in a push of Great Replacement theory. And what Great Replacement theory states is that slowly over time, the United States is becoming full of more people who were once ethnic minorities, but one day will no longer be minorities and will become the majority of the population of the United States. And as white people cease to be more prominent and cease to be the main cultural bloc in our nation, they will in turn have less power, and that is bad. A huge underlying part of the Great Replacement theory is not necessarily that it is wrong, because the United States is becoming more ethnically and culturally diverse, but the fact that diversity is in and of itself wrong. And you and I both know some living and deceased podcasters who are very vocal proponents of this theory. And San Diego is no exception. Wherever that theory exists, there are groups or factions of white people who want to dig their heels in a little deeper to attempt to resist this cultural overtaking that is going to destroy our nation, or whatever it is they say. So what that means is you have a group of disenfranchised white men in San Diego who are resentful of the fact that there are people who have different traditions, who look differently from them, who think differently from them, who are coming and being successful in the United States. And so just to give you guys a snapshot of that, there were young white men in my high school, and it was an incredibly diverse high school, that would come into school carrying Confederate flags across the entire campus. I actually once even ended up getting a ride from one of these folks, and I didn't realize that he was actually like a white supremacist until one of his ex-friends showed me a photo of the Confederate flag hanging up in the room. So ask yourself at this point in time, what the heck does San Diego have to do with the Confederacy? Exactly. I mentioned those examples to give you guys the distinct image of the disenfranchised white man who, by the way, had no ties to the South, but were desperate to cling to a concept of white people being at the head of power. This is not uncommon in San Diego. And you're going to run into people who believe this kind of ideology towards the outskirts of San Diego, more east and north. Now, where this tragedy occurred is not in those places. But what I am saying is that among young San Diegan white males, there is an increasing popularity of white nationalism. With MAGA rising in popularity, the myth that these white men are owed an abundance that they believe just pops up and is handed to them in the United States and are thus being robbed by an influx of new immigrants who practice different religions and look different from them. This is something that is rising in popularity. So the two men who committed this crime, one of them is Caleb Vasquez and the other is Kane Clark. Kane Clark is a 17-year-old who wrote a suicide note to his family that included topics of preserving his racial purity and preserving the racial purity of what he perceives to be the home that he's owed. And as much as we want to blame the internet for introducing these kinds of violent topics to men, we cannot ignore the fact that it is becoming more popular in the county that these young men grew up in and that it has influenced them to commit the crimes that they did. What I wanted to point out as the cruel irony is the fact that what moved these boys to go and kill people in cold blood is a victimhood that they have placed in their own minds that has been encouraged by the other boys around them and by the internet that they access, that they are victims to what will become a violent nation if people who do not look or think like them continue to exist, all while they become the violent aggressors that end up killing parents and children in innocence. These two disenfranchised white men ended up running back to their car and using their own arms against themselves to end their own lives when they found out that they could no longer continue to harm the innocent women, men, and children that were located inside of that mosque. And in the end, I think that's really reflective of what white nationalism is, because it always ends in cowardice. Always. The very thesis of white nationalism is based in fear, an unwillingness to accept that people who look or think differently from them may perhaps end up having more power than them. And because they've seen the way that United States history specifically has treated those who do not have power compared to those who do, they're scared of what people who think differently from them may do once they achieve that power. And so they rage and they thrash and they seek to harm people who could not defend themselves in an attempt to try and even out the grounds, and then they refuse to face the law and order that they claim to defend with anti-illegal immigrant and even anti-immigrant sentiments in general. So when people tell me podcasters such as Charlie Kirk only had opinions, and one of his opinions were there should be no immigrants entering the United States, period, and endorsing the Great Replacement theory, yes, I do have problems with his opinions. Because while there are extremists in every single religion and every single political ideology, any political or religious ideology that encourages intolerance of people who are different simply for the basis of race, religion, gender, sexuality will never end in a safer community. It will always end in a petri dish for extremists to thrive in. San Diego is the latest petri dish to bring about these kind of results, and it is unfortunate, especially for the families of these people who are simply seeking to practice their religion in peace with other practitioners of their faith. So the last thing, I want to end this video acknowledging the hero who is Amin Abdullah. He was a security guard who put himself in harm's way in order to protect the people who were present at that mosque. And may I remind you, it was not just a mosque. It was a mosque and an Arabic language school. So this location contained plenty of young, innocent, God's most precious children. The lives of those who are now deceased, who have been injured, and even those who were simply present and didn't see any violence will never be the same. The lives of their families and the lives of the San Diego community will never be the same. We do have a responsibility to remember the people whose lives were lost, and we have an obligation to remember what happens when we encourage this lie. There's a phrase in Spanish that says, El sol brilla para todos, which means the sun shines for all. And if you're a Christian and you have found yourself falling into these white nationalist, Christian nationalist beliefs, may I remind you that the Lord paid the servants who arrived on time and the servants who arrived late the exact same amount, because there is enough goodness to go around for everyone. If you truly believe that this nation is a blessed land in its own unique way, then you should know that there is plenty of opportunity and resources to go around, especially in such a beautiful place like San Diego, and that we have an obligation to stamp out any rhetoric that states otherwise.